People are probably not aware that you were born and partially raised in Vienna. So Anthony said we could go ahead and do this in German.
Ja, natürlich, gut.
Okay, servus. Also,
Servus, servus.
can we just see a show of hands who would object? It's not many, so we can do it in German.
Ja, mach mal's auf Englisch.
Pretty good. Yeah, judging from your numerous posts and tweets, one wonders where is actually home for you these days?
Well, so I live in Hong Kong, but last year I've been in Hong Kong for less than 2 months in the whole year, so I've been traveling around. And I think we decided, especially last year, because of everything that's happened in the industry, to become more vocal. For a long time, we were sort of, you know, I guess more quiet builder types, but the industry we felt needed a different type of voice. And also regulators at the time, particularly in Asia, were steering very much negatively towards crypto. And because we're not an exchange, because we're in gaming and NFTs, we felt that we were able to give a perspective that was actually sort of a different narrative as to the true purpose around Web3. And for instance, what most people don't maybe know here in this room is that places like Hong Kong, for instance, or even Japan, most of the people entered Web3 because of NFTs, which is perhaps different from the industry, say, 5 years ago, where most people might have entered because of Bitcoin, right, or because of investment opportunities and so on. So that was something else that we wanted to make sure that people were aware of, and we think that trend will continue.
I mean, regarding cultures, you are a wanderer between the worlds, and that gives you a pretty good overview of where to take the best advantage for your business and where to settle down. I mean, where do you see currently the biggest differences between the East and West when it comes to Web3 adoption? And how do you believe these different go-aheads will turn out?
So generally speaking, we try to look at the whole Web3 space as a lens of sort of like economies, so like nations. So we compare them, whether it's an L1, L2, or even a metaverse, kind of like a country. And so we look at what are the things that actually bind together sort of the strength of a country, and that would typically be culture, right? Or whether you call it culture in the form of nationalism, patriotism, identity. Those are the things that actually really put people together. And I remember, so I grew up in Austria when I was very young, and Austria was one of the later countries to join the EU. But one of the big identity crises that Europe had at the time when the EU started was a loss of currency. And today we don't think of the fact that there was a shilling or a Deutschmark or a lira, but so many people were distraught, and actually I would argue became even more nationalistic and patriotic to their particular areas, because they lost a really important part of their identity. And so let's translate this a little bit to Web3. I mean, Bitcoin maxis or Solana guys or Ethereum, name your ecosystem. And you can't just say that they're there for very utilitarian purposes only. They have identity. They are believers. Maybe it started with, basically promoting their bags, potentially. But actually, what's happened, they became part of that culture and that identity. And that creates loyalty, and that creates essentially a willingness to build into this. And when you think of culture, actually, since this is, we're crypto guys, so let's talk in crypto terms. We think culture is the deepest TVL of any economy, right? Everything we spend today is in culture. The transactional layer and the things that we do in trade and finance, yes, there's money there, but actually that's kind of surface. What actually makes the economy is that we're investing in things that are beyond the pure utility for it, because otherwise we'd all be driving the same cars, we'd be still having newer versions of Ford Model Ts that are just faster or efficient. We'll be wearing the same shoes. All of us will be wearing black, right? None of us would have any different type of identity. We would not have jewelry. We would not have none of that stuff, and we wouldn't care that one house that's 5 minutes away could be worth 10 times more than the other house because of social status and identity, culture, and community. So culture is the deepest thing that we invest in, and Web3 is the sort of, I guess, a way in which you can now express that digitally. So I think, NFTs is a way to do that. We think of NFTs as a store of digital culture, which, by the way, is why we think Ordinals is so exciting, because it introduces that element of storing digital culture in the Bitcoin ecosystem. And we also think that's where most of the adoption comes from in the future, not just with gaming, but generally, because I'm not from the financial world. I studied music first a long time ago. That's why I was born and raised in Vienna. Not my choice, by the way. And then afterwards, I went into computer science and then gaming. So the financial world is relatively new to me in relative terms. I lived in Hong Kong, which is a very financial city, so I'm always exposed to it. But that was not my world. And what I think is that the majority of the world isn't financial in nature. as in they look at money as a means to an end, a cultural end, a social end, a community end. You know, I want to make money so I can have a nice house, or I can have a family, or I can live well, and you know, have respect in my community. But for a certain community, and I think this is maybe very early forms of people who joined, I guess, the crypto world, money was the end itself, right? And so we went into a period of phase where we have a more sort of, I guess, speculative, transactional culture, which is okay, that's how it started, kind of more Wall Street in nature. But now it's getting slowly replaced by that. And so I think this is also how we look at the cycle. When you look at 21, 22, you know, even with NFTs, they were very speculative because the audiences that were there were predominantly speculative in nature. And now as more people joined Web3 for culture and community, that aspect has changed. And so on East and West, there's also one difference is that Asia has been very forward on this one. So Hong Kong, Japan, Southeast Asia have made basically Web3 as sort of a national prerogative. So they want to make metaverse a big thing, and they see this as an economic development. In the US, I think there's people building in the space, but because of the regulatory uncertainties, shall we say, you know, there's been a case of, I mentioned this a little bit yesterday in a talk, a sense of quasi-self-censorship that's taking place, which is kind of reversed, right? You know, I live in Hong Kong, and I know people in China, and they will not do certain things because, not because there is a regulation, but because there's a lack of clarity. So they prefer not to do it. So maybe they shouldn't talk about this or do that. And I find, ironically, that actually this is happening in America with people building in the Web3 space, which is ironic because I think blockchain is perhaps one of the most American things ever.
You started out studying music. What made you change? I mean, let's talk about Animoca Brands and your journey towards it. What was the pivotal moment that caused you to move towards the blockchain ecosystem, the blockchain culture? Was there one particular event that triggered it all?
Well, I mean, first, I realized I was a pretty bad musician. So my parents are musicians. My mom has perfect pitch. So I grew up in a family of musical geniuses, and I was an only child. And maybe if I had siblings, that might be a person that would have been really good, and my parents' attention would have been on that kid. But unfortunately, you know, I grew up in an Asian family. So, you know, tiger parenting, it's all true. So I went to the music conservatory. So some people say, wow, that's like really great, but I just had to work 10 times harder than everyone else. So I would practice 8 hours a day and so on. And then I would go there and then I see my fellow students, and it was a really humbling exercise. So I definitely knew what I didn't want to do. So I think the one thing that I learned from music was just discipline, like just raw, hard discipline. But because of music, and I grew up in Austria, and so I'm a child of the 70s. I think there were a few things that I think led to that experience, to maybe the thinking about Animoca Brands' philosophy, which is, first of all, for those of you who remember, this was pre-Vende. So basically, this was, you know, when there was still an Iron Curtain. And my mom was an artist. Two things I experienced. She was always taken advantage from a money standpoint because she knew nothing about money. She was an artist, and managers and, you know, different people would manage her, and of course. At the end of the day, they would just manage her out of her money, as the way that I see it. But the other one is she also used to spend a lot of time in East Germany. She used to work at the Komische Oper, which was on the eastern side of Berlin. And so I would travel across, and I would see that world. And that has a, you know, I wouldn't know what that was back then, but as a child had a really incredible impression on me, as in, like, I don't want that, right? And I think most people don't even remember that time because maybe they weren't born. And they've forgotten that actually what can happen when you go that far into sort of true, I guess, ideas of communism. And then, you know, going from, you know, a social democratic environment to America, I worked for Atari, and I uploaded basically a MIDI software into a pre-internet service called CompuServe. And this introduced me to the world of online, sort of the pre-metaversal experience, where I got to recognize that it didn't matter how old I was a kid. It didn't matter that I was an Asian in Austria, which in the 70s and 80s was an anomaly, right? And I got a job at what was one of the fastest tech companies at the time that basically emerged me over there. Went to America, experienced hypercapitalism, then went to Hong Kong, which was capitalism on steroids, Milton Friedman's absolutely wet dream. And I ended up sort of experiencing the problems that were there, because then in Hong Kong itself, you know, we would still have 70, 80-year-old senior citizens cart rubbish up the, you know, even despite its wealth, because they had that extreme form of capitalism and no social services despite its wealth. So seeing all of that has essentially led to, I guess, the thinking as to how we're thinking about Web3 and Animoca. The moment started with NFTs with CryptoKitties, but the philosophy of sort of what we think about Web3 as a shared network really was the evolution of, I would say, decades of just experiencing life in sort of serendipitous and momentary sort of times wherever I was.
Is there any particular point of influence or a mentor or something that has influenced you throughout your professional journey?
So I don't know that I have a role model in the classic sense, but I do enjoy, and I guess this is the thing about when you grow up in Europe, they make you read philosophy, right? And things like Kant and so on. So it's hard to know whether this is something that is intrinsic to me or whether this is just because, and my mom was also a big reader of philosophy. And when you're in the arts, you basically study philosophy and music is part of all of that. So I would definitely had Kantian influence. That's not to say that I am a Kantian per se, but as a result, I read philosophy. I would say I'm more attracted to the ideas of, American liberalism, John Locke, Adam Smith. I'm attracted to sort of, I guess, the philosophies of Rawls, but not on those more socialist-leaning ideas, but more about the fact that I think there's an idea that the world needs to have more equity and justice, and that broader distribution of wealth is a good thing, but not to say that there cannot be inequity. So I'm a capitalist, but I think the current form of capitalism is broken and has created all these problems. But I think there's an element there which I think Web3 can help solve. So I think the mission of growing Web3 to me, therefore, is bigger. And I would say if there is a philosophy, if you want to frame it that way, is I've always wanted to have impact and purpose, but how do you get there? You just don't know. So the satisfaction comes from maybe being in a position where I'm able to sort of build something that could have a real impact, that can drive a real purpose. And I generally believe that people have an intrinsic notion of that purpose is good, but maybe that's partially because of the way I was raised, right? So I'm not going to make a judgment as to whether humans are born thinking good, or the fact that Austria was also a very Roman Catholic country, so I was forced to go to church. I'm not religious, but that's what we used to do. It was just a thing to do, and so all of these learnings do come into you, and so from that framework, I think people are generally tuned for positive outcomes. We just have to help them get there.
So, although your parents weren't religious, I suppose they decided that educating you in a Catholic way would make sense in Austria.
Well, so my parents
integrate, to better blend.
I mean, my parents were from the generation of, for those who remember a little bit of Chinese history, that was the time of the Cultural Revolution. And so my parents never thought I would go back to Asia, or for that matter, Hong Kong or China, right? It's like telling someone to, go into a war zone at the time. And integration was really important. So my Chinese is terrible because they speak Chinese to each other, but they spoke German to me, just to make sure that I was fully integrated. And I think there's some stories of other ABCs, not Austrian-born, but American-born Chinese, who have a similar story where their parents really sort of, when they immigrated, wanted to integrate them into culture and society so deeply, to the point where they might even lose their identity. Which is interesting because when I went to America, that's the first time I saw so many Chinese people in Chinatown. I was like, what is this, right? So again, so in some ways, you could see how people react so firmly around, if you're trying to eradicate a culture, actually there's a counter reaction, which is like, let's do everything we can to sort of preserve it. And so in many ways, Chinatown is actually, China 30 years ago, right? In terms of, it's like a capsule in time.
Yeah, I could argue that some Europeans that went over to the States, to the Midwest, are more German or more European traditional style than the Europeans these days. Let's continue to talk about education. You mentioned how you were raised. Education has been a theme for you, especially in the recent years, where also NFTs are bound to help stabilize inequalities. Where do you see the potential of NFTs when it comes to education? And could you give a concrete example that you with Animoca Brands are pursuing?
Sure. So first, generally speaking, when we talk about the power of NFTs, we're talking about property rights, right? And when you have actual property rights, as we have in the physical world, you have the ability to create capital appreciation and turn it into a capital asset. And I think that's what's really valuable here, because everything can be turned into a capital asset. The problem in the past is that only valuable things could be turned into capital asset, or at least what we perceive as valuable, like real estate, for instance. If the house has certain value, or if it's music that has certain kind of royalties, then you can use a lawyer and whatever to sort of transact that. But with NFTs, you can actually do that type of stuff literally with just a single transaction, where you can embed with it the intellectual property rights, the contract rights, where the money goes in a transaction that is literally less than $1. So which means everything can be turned into IP. And so we looked at the market, and there were two reasons we focused on. I had a long history in education, but we won't delve into that right now. But I think the one thing we do recognize is that teachers around the world are getting paid very, very little, broadly around the world, but have one of the most important tasks, which is educate our kids, especially in K-12. And what we saw was that if they were making content that they could sell online, but they would make like $50 or $100 maybe a year on this content, that's like side hustle, right? Which is not much money, but they'll still do it. But if you give it property rights, that intellectual property, which already creates money, then you can make it a yield asset. So that means something that makes maybe $100 a year, you can now actually maybe sell it for $500 or $1,000 to someone else because they're willing to buy it for a 10 or 20% yield. And so really what you're doing is what you do with music royalties or other type of intellectual property, but you're expanding it down to all sorts of assets. Now, take a place like Venezuela. A teacher makes $10 to $15 a month. Even if he only makes $10 to $20 a year on this content, if it sells for $100, it's actually life-changing. And we've seen these examples in play to earn with gaming with Axie Infinity in the Philippines, where now crypto has become such an essential part, onboarding people into financial ecosystems. So, with Open Campus and TinyTap, we've basically been pushing that narrative. And we also feel that it's an important political narrative, because one of the things that we saw in the last couple of years was that we do believe that Web3 gaming is going to be transformative to the industry in terms of adoption, but and financial services as well. But neither of these are great political campaign material. Right? You're not going to get someone elected because they onboarded 1 billion people into Web3 gaming and made money on it, right? Most of the parental constituents would say, hey, that's not a good idea. I don't want my kids to play games, even if you make money on it, in the same way that they objected to, I grew up in a time where, those parents' generation objected from us watching TV, for instance, right? I mean, it's the same thing. But education and teachers is a different thing. If you can make teachers more money in this space, then that's not just a political narrative, it's a social good, it's something people understand, and it's actually creating a realizing capital asset value that wasn't there before.
So what advice would you give teachers throughout the world, how they can best monetize their IP? Because today the biggest education platform, I suppose, is YouTube, where everything is free. How do you want to move them over? It's not free, you pay with marketing.
Yeah, so I mean, just to very quickly, so currently the Web2 world is not really a market, because it's platforms that are basically monopolizing everything. And what's happening in YouTube is, these rent-seeking platforms, what YouTube actually does is, you're generating value, but you're generating value for YouTube. And so you're really generating what you think is fame, but actually YouTube monetizes this, creates data paradigms, and is selling it back to you in the form of advertising. And now they have this creator program where you can make a little bit of money, but it's basically a pittance, relatively speaking. And so they can make content this way, but what we suggest people do is they make this content on platforms such as Web3 platforms like TinyTap or Open Campus. That content is then sold as an IP asset, which you can use somewhere else. And because these platforms generate revenue, the yield, the ownership of that yield can then basically go to a third party. You could do this, by the way, with YouTube. The risk, though, when you do this on a platform is they might deplatform you, right? They basically will take away if they don't like what you're doing, which happens all the time. I think the other thing is that if you teach teachers about crypto and Web3, then naturally they can teach the next generation. One of the problems that most teachers have is even if you want the world to become more financially literate, well, the teachers don't know anything about finances anyway. They don't have an investment portfolio. They know nothing about money. They don't talk about that. I think my children never learned anything about money. I certainly didn't. Growing up in Europe, you generally don't talk about money. So I think the problem is that one of the perhaps the most important thing that we need to understand in society is not taught, except for a very small percentage. And then we're surprised that a very small percentage of the world knows stuff that we don't and can take advantage of it. So if you can actually create financial literacy to teachers by giving them a capital asset, by introducing them to this, then they will teach it to the next generations and the generations thereafter, which I then think will actually redraw and reshape, I guess, the way that the world could look like.
Thank you, Yat. It's always a pleasure to listen to your philosophies on life. Beyond business success, what is the kind of legacy that you want to leave with everything that you're doing?
I never thought of it in terms of legacies. I thought of it more in terms of impact, as I said earlier. And so I think one of the things that I've come to realize is that if you can build a movement, right, then actually that's bigger than you and your name and whatever that is, then I think you have something lasting. So it's not about really, I think, how people would remember me, but rather how people would remember digital property rights or financial literacy. That to me is the more important notion. And by the time it's owned by everyone and nobody even knows, right, then I actually think that's the legacy that we should be proud of.
Ladies and gentlemen, Yat Siu.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.